Here's a question that sounds almost too simple to bother asking. Why did ancient humans wear underwear? I mean, come on, obviously the cover up, right? To stay decent. Case closed. Except that's wrong. Or at least, it's the least interesting part of the answer. Because the moment you actually try to explain it, the whole thing cracks open into something much stranger. A story about ice, about survival, about a piece of technology so old it predates farming, predates writing, predates cities, and a mystery scientist cracked using head lice. So why did ancient humans wear underwear? Seriously, sit with that for a second, because the real answer isn't about modesty at all. This goes back further than you think. Older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than the first word ever scratched into clay. We're talking about something humans were doing before we ever left Africa, before we spread across a frozen planet. And the evidence for it is genuinely strange. It survives in glaciers, in cave dirt, and, weirdly, in the DNA of the tiny insects that live on us. There are really two questions hiding in here. The first is the obvious one. What did they wear down there and why? And the second, the far more interesting one, is when did we start covering ourselves at all, and what that first choice reveals about becoming human. Hold on to that second one. It's where this ends up, and the last piece might change how you see the clothes you put on this morning. Before you can wear underwear, you need one thing most people never stop to consider. You need to have lost your fur. Think about that. Every other great ape, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, is covered head to toe in hair. They don't get cold the way you do. They don't need a stitch of anything. And here's the wild part. Research into human skin coloration suggests we lost most of our body hair around 1 million years ago. But we didn't start wearing clothes anywhere near that early. So picture it. Hundreds of thousands of years of humans walking the earth naked and hairless. No fur to keep warm. No fabric either, just bare skin, exposed to wind and sun and cold for an almost unimaginable stretch of time. We were the naked ape long before we were the dressed one. And then, somewhere, something changed. Here's where the lice come in, and this is one of the strangest detective stories in all of archaeology. In 2011, a researcher named David Reed at the University of Florida published a study in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution. He wasn't digging up fabric. He was sequencing the DNA of lice. Because here's the thing. Head lice live in your hair. But body lice, clothing lice, live in your clothes. They can't survive without them. So these two kinds of louse must have split from a common ancestor at the exact moment humans gave them a new place to live. Garments. Find when the lice diverged and you found roughly when we started wearing clothes regularly. The answer? Around 170,000 years ago. Read that again, 170,000 years. Long before we'd ever set foot in the frozen north of Europe or Asia. Now, an earlier study from 2003, led by geneticist Mark Stoneking at the Max Planck Institute, put the date closer to 107,000 years. So the honest truth is we don't know the precise number. The range is wide, and scientists still argue about it. But that argument is the interesting part. Because both dates land in the same shocking place, we were clothing ourselves in Africa in a warm climate, tens of thousands of years before we ever needed to. Which flips the whole assumption on its head. Most people think clothes were invented because humans got cold. But the timing says otherwise. We were tinkering with covering ourselves before the cold ever forced our hand. It wasn't pure necessity. It was something more like invention for its own sake. But knowing when doesn't tell you what. And this is where it gets frustrating because of a brutal rule that haunts this entire field. Soft things rot. Leather, plant fiber, animal skin, organic material breaks down in centuries, sometimes decades. Stone tools last essentially forever. So we have millions of ancient stone blades and almost no ancient clothing. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It just means the underwear dissolved, which makes the rare survivors almost priceless, and the most famous one was found by accident, sticking out of a melting glacier. In 1991, hikers in the Tyrolean Alps stumbled on a body. They thought it was a modern climbing casualty. It wasn't. It was a man who had died around 3300 BC, over 5,000 years ago, and been freeze-dried and preserved by the ice ever since. We call him Ötzi. And Ötzi wasn't just a body. He came fully dressed. Under his woven grass cloak, against his skin, he wore a leather loincloth, a strip of hide drawn between the legs and belted at the waist. This is the earliest confirmed undergarment we have ever physically recovered. Not a drawing, not a guess. The actual thing still on the actual person. And here's the reversal. That loincloth wasn't about shame. Ötzi was a working man moving through brutal mountain terrain. His underwear was gear. It was protection for the softest, most vulnerable part of the body against cold, against chafing, against the endless friction of a body in motion across rough country. Underwear, at its origin, was closer to a tool than to a fashion statement or a moral rule. Think of it as a base layer. The exact same reason a hiker or a soldier today wears one under everything else. Ötzi had independently arrived at gear that any outdoor guide would recognize on sight. But leather is one thing. Woven cloth is another entirely, and making it takes real skill. So, could people that ancient actually make fabric? For a long time, the assumption was no, not really, not that far back. Then they found something in a cave in the country of Georgia that shouldn't have been there. In 2009, a team led by Eliso Kavadze published a discovery in the journal Science from a place called Zudzwana Cave. Buried in the dirt were flax fibers, wild flax twisted into thread. And these weren't crude. They were spun, they were knotted, and some of them had been dyed. Turquoise, black, pink. The age, more than 34,000 years old. The oldest textile fibers ever found on Earth. Let that sink in. 34,000 years ago, deep in the Ice Age, someone was sitting in a cave making colored thread, not just surviving, decorating. The picture of the grunting, fur-draped caveman is a cartoon. These people had craft. They had aesthetics. They had color. We constantly underestimate the people who came before us. Now, we have to be honest about something. A thread is not a pair of underpants. Nobody dug up 34,000-year-old briefs, and they never will. It rotted long ago. Twisting fiber and deliberately weaving a fitted garment are two different claims, and we can't prove the second from the first. But you don't spin dyed thread for no reason. You spin it to sew skins together, to make cord, to bind, to wrap the body. The capability was there, tens of thousands of years earlier than anyone assumed. The raw skill that eventually produced every waistband you own was already in human hands during the Ice Age. There's one last layer, and I saved it for the end, because it's the strangest part of all of this. Remember the lice, the clue that we were wearing clothes 170,000 years ago, back in warm Africa, long before the cold demanded it. Sit with what that actually means. We didn't cover ourselves because we had to. We started before we needed to. And that changes the whole question. Maybe underwear was never really about the weather at all. Maybe from the very beginning it was about something else. Protecting the vulnerable body, yes, but also marking ourselves, separating human from animal. Deciding that this part of us was ours to cover or reveal. A choice no other creature on Earth has ever made. And that choice is still in you. You made it this morning, half asleep without a thought. The same decision a man made in an alpine pass 5,000 years ago, reaching for his loincloth before he climbed. So why did ancient humans wear underwear? Not for one reason. For all of them at once. They wore it for protection. Against cold and rock and friction. They wore it because they could, because their hands had learned to spin and stitch and dye. And they wore it because somewhere along the way we became the one animal that covers itself and never looked back. From a strip of leather frozen in a glacier, to dyed thread in an Ice Age cave, to lice DNA whispering a date of 170,000 years. The story runs deeper into our past than almost anything else we do. It's not a footnote. It's one of the oldest human habits there is. So the next time you get dressed and you reach for that first layer without even thinking, stop. just for a second. You're not just getting ready. You're repeating the oldest choice we ever made.